I've made 2 different videos about sewing leaf-shaped garments, and I still have more leaf ideas, so I'm making a third. I've wanted to make a waistcoat like this for several years now, and I've drawn it quite a few times in my sketchbook. I wanted the fronts to look like 2 big leaves with serrated edges, buttons on the serrations, and the leaf tips forming the lapels. I figured a late 18th century shape would be the best starting point, so I used my 1790s waistcoat pattern, minus the collar. I finally got this pattern to fit by making different pieces for each side, to account for my wonky shoulders. I traced it out onto thin polycotton mock-up fabric, marking the center front line in a darker ink. I cut it with a lot of extra material on the neck and front edge. I sewed up the back, shoulders, and sides, leaving those large areas of neck seam allowance open so it wouldn't sit funny. After pressing the seams and clipping the underarm seam allowances, I tried it on. The fabric is kind of see-through, which allowed me to line up the center front lines and pin it closed accurately. I sketched out the leaf shape on the overlap using a light-colored marker, and roughly where I wanted the midrib and buttons to be. I took it off and drew things on in more detail. Once I had a pleasing arrangement of veins, serrations, and buttons, I traced over them in green ink. I lined up and pinned the 2 fronts together so I could cut them both down to the right size and shape. Then I traced the veins onto the other side of the front. I added veins to the back too. The tip of that leaf is at the back of the neck, so the veins branch upwards. I tried drawing serrations on the side and shoulder seams to make it look like the leaf edges were overlapping, but decided against it. It would only draw attention to how much I had to distort the edge of an otherwise normal leaf shape to make it fit around my shoulders. Much better to have the veins disappear into a smooth side seam. I cut down the edges to where I'd drawn the serrations and tried it on again. Then I took apart the mock-up. I felt like there were too many veins on the front, so I tried drawing one less button. I did prefer the closer button spacing, but I think this way looks better overall. For my final pattern, I'm using this wallpaper I got for free at an estate sale. It was very curly and needed ironing with a dry iron. I traced out my late 18th century waistcoat pattern, all 4 pieces, because as mentioned it's a bit asymmetrical in the shoulder area. I traced the outline of my mock-up piece onto it and marked the location of the midrib. I redrew the front edge to fit 1 fewer button and drew out the veins in mostly the same arrangement they were on the mock-up. I'm adding serrated edges all around the front, bottom, and neck, but I'm leaving the armhole smooth. I cut out the side and shoulder edges so I could match them up to the back piece. Even though the veins are not going to line up front to back, I still need to make sure the curves on the edges fit together smoothly. I drew the veins onto the back pieces, making them different on either side, since I prefer my leaves to be at least a little bit asymmetrical. I extended the center back seam up just a tiny bit to add a small leaf tip. With one front piece completed, I could now cut it out and mark the fold line for the lapel. I marked the center front so I could lay it over the other front piece and see how they're meant to overlap. I shaved a couple millimeters off the bottom of the underlap so it wouldn't stick out. I wanted to trace the veins onto the other front piece, so I went over them somewhat messily in Sharpie and set up my makeshift light table. It's a window pane over 2 boxes with a light under it. It has to be a cool kind of light bulb, not one that gets hot. I stuck the left front pattern piece to the window with painter's tape, taped the right front over top of it, and traced all the veins in pencil. I realized afterwards that I didn't really need to do that because the front pieces are similar enough that I could just use one of them to mark out the veins on both sides when I get to that point, but oh well. I finished drawing the edges and cut all the pieces out. I trued the edges and notched all the balance marks. I made sure the center front and grain lines were all marked, and that all my pieces were labeled. I wrote this side up because having different pieces for the right and left sides means I've got to trace them only once and they need to be the right way around. Since this waistcoat has a lapel, it needs a facing piece. I traced my fronts onto some drawer liner paper, which also came from an estate sale and also needed ironing. I marked the lapel fold line and the center front grain line on and just drew a couple of straight lines around the lapel area. I labeled and cut out my new lining and facing pieces and notched the balance marks on those too. I knew I wanted to sew it up in obi silk, which is 30 centimeters wide. I could piece it vertically, but that seam would be very obvious, so a better option would be to hide it under the embroidery by piecing it along the midrib. It just barely fits. This will put the fronts on the bias, but that's okay. The fabric is pretty heavy and will have a lot of stiffening, so it shouldn't make much difference. I traced another copy of the fronts and cut them out, just so I could keep my intact front pieces. I transferred the midrib lines onto the copies using my spiky tracing wheel. I made some balance marks and cut along the lines. I thought it would be nice to put a small pocket in that seam, so I made a pocket piece and marked the opening with more notches. I did not end up using this pocket because I figured it wouldn't get along well with the embroidery and the construction order I decided to use, but hopefully I'll use it in a later version. I lined up some button blanks with the ends of the veins, so I could mark the right distance away from the edge through the holes. I folded the paper to notch those marks with my pattern notcher, and these will be the ends of my buttonholes. The last step was to punch holes in all the pattern pieces, so I could hang them up with a shower curtain hook. Then I remembered that I also needed to pattern the interfacing. So I traced the front edge, and after drawing on the center front line, traced it the other way around so I could make it as wide as the full overlap. This was way too much interfacing, and I will do it differently next time, but more on that later in the video. I smoothed out that inner side a bit and extended it up into the neckline. The lapel is cut off just below the fold line. I then made an extra piece to reinforce the area where the buttons will be attached. And another piece for the bottom edge of the fronts. Now my pattern was finally done. For the main fabric, I'm using the plain section of this obi, which I got on eBay for very cheap. It's a very heavy orange silk satin, which is just perfect for a fancy autumn leaf. In my previous waistcoat video, I also used obi silk and mentioned how difficult it was to get the creases out of it. But more recently, I found that spraying them with a lot of water and rubbing the crease with the round end of a bone folder helps quite a bit. It still doesn't get all of them all the way out, but it's more effective than just ironing. I did all this on the wrong side of the fabric, so as to not leave any obvious shiny patches. And I'm sure it's different for different silks, but the water didn't leave any visible marks on this stuff. For the lapel facing, I went with a slightly darker reddish-brown silk from a different obi. I looked through my stash of embroidery floss and found some potential colors for the veins. I traced the facings using light blue fabric pencil and cut them out. and traced and cut out all 4 main front pieces. For the lining, I'm using a lightweight cotton that's very similar in color to the facing. It's actually the cotton I considered and then did not use for the brown apron in my apron video. Normally I would use something stiffer and slipperier for the lining, but it's fine. I traced the front lining pieces with the white side of the paper up, but for the back linings I had to remember to trace them pattern side up, since the other way up is for the outer fabric. And for that outer back fabric I found a small bit of linen in my stash. It's a warm light brown that goes well with the other colors and has a bit of an uneven dye job for added leaf flavor. I traced these pieces with graphite pencil. And did the same on the interfacing, which is some stiff cotton interlining from an obi. Normally I would use a heavy buckram for the front edge of a waistcoat, but that didn't feel right for the edge of a leaf, especially with the silk already being so thick. These get cut with no seam allowance. I did use heavy buckram for the button stand though. This is linen stiffened with white glue. I cut another smaller strip to layer on top of it, since I usually fold these in half on straighter edges. Then it was finally time to start sewing it up. I pinned the halves of the fronts together, matching up the marks and traced line all along the curve. And pinned the center back seam on both the outside and lining. I also pinned the facing onto the front lining, but only on the long edge. I started sewing them up with dark brown polyester thread because I already had some on a bobbin, but the bobbin ran out partway through the second front seam. I found some light brown thread in my stash and switched to that. I'm using a small stitch length on the silk because it frays pretty easily and I don't want to risk it pulling apart. I sewed up the 2 center back seams and the long edge of the facing. I started the facing seams from the outside edge, and when I got to the corner of the facing I stopped and pivoted the other way around so I could backstitch more accurately along the seam. I used an even smaller stitch length for the end of that part. On the fronts, I clipped the seam allowances on the inward curve and notched them on the outward curve, so they'd lie nice and flat when I pressed them open. Unfortunately, when I did press them open, the outline of the seam allowances showed through very badly. I cut a curve through a sheet of cardstock and pressed those seams again, with the cardstock in between the seam allowances and the outer fabric, and it looked a lot better after that. I also trimmed the corners off the ends of those seam allowances. I trimmed the center back seam allowances, clipped the inward curves, and pressed those seams open. On the front linings, I clipped into the inner corner of the seam allowance, stopping just a couple of millimeters from the end of the seam. I pressed all the seam allowance towards the lining side, since the lining is much thinner than the silk facing. Then I lined up the other leg of the facing seam and sewed and pressed it in the same way, giving me a nice clean corner. Now it was time to sew the interfacing onto the fronts. I pinned it in place. The edge of the interfacing didn't completely line up with the traced line on the silk because the fabric had shifted from all the pressing, but that's okay. I'm tacking it on with variegated cotton quilting thread from my stash. It doesn't exactly match the orange, but it's close enough. Just a little bit of waxing to smooth out the fuzz. I'm trying to make the stitches as small as I reasonably can on the outside of the fabric. For the serrated parts, I'm keeping them close together and close to the edge of the interfacing because I don't want the tips to get messed up and folded later when I turn that edge right side out. For the smoother inside edges, I used a somewhat wider spacing. The stitches do show up on the outside, but there's not really any way to avoid that with satin. For the part that's closer to the middle of the silk piece, I sewed it with one hand underneath it right at the edge of the table, and was able to keep it relatively flat without much difficulty. I had forgotten, when patterning the bottom edge interfacing, that the serrations closest to the side seam were a bit different, so the edge was a little bit off for reasons more than just warping. I didn't bother recutting it, but I did go back and make a separate interfacing pattern piece afterwards. I had to place the button stand right where the buttons will be, so I laid the pattern piece back on the right front and marked the top and bottom of the center front line with pins. I flipped the pattern around and lined up the center front again, and then marked the button locations right where they should be on the finished overlap. I marked around that area so I could line up the button stand on top of that row of button marks and sewed the buckram on. Then I marked the button spots on again, lined up the smaller strip of buckram as best I could, and sewed that on too. In hindsight, I could have just machine sewn that smaller strip of buckram onto the wider one before sewing it in. I laid the linings on the fronts, right sides together, and smoothed them out and pinned them. No need to worry about matching up the traced lines exactly, because I'll be sewing it from the outer fabric side. I sewed the whole front and bottom edge with a small stitch length, because I'm going to be trimming the seam allowance down a lot. I did some pivoting, but for a lot of it I was able to just go slowly around the curves with a hand wheel. I trimmed the seam allowance down to about 3mm all along the serrated edge. This was a bit too small, as we will see later. I carefully made tiny little clips in all the inward curves. I turned the fronts right side out and pushed the tips out on the lapels with the help of a bamboo point turner, but for the rest of the edge the interfacing pushed things out nicely. I pressed all around the edge, making sure none of the lining was sticking out past the silk. On the lapel I pressed from the outer fabric side, with the facing edge sticking out a bit further. I placed the back pieces right sides together and lined up and pinned the center back seam so I could smooth out each side and pin the top and bottom edge. This time I'm sewing from the lining side because the traced line is more clearly visible there, and the cotton is far less shifty and wiggly than the linen. I'm trimming it down and clipping it just like before, turning the back right sides out and pressing the points. I then lined up the center back seams, pinned them together, and basted them so they'll stay put for the rest of the construction. But I'm going to do all the veins before I sew the front and back together. I have done a sample, and have decided that for the main part of the waistcoat, this embroidery floss is too light, and I'm going to start with my darkest brown, even though I don't have very much of it. And then I can move on to these colors when I run out. It just looks a lot nicer than the other stuff. And for the lapel, instead of the straw-colored floss, I am going to use gold. To mark out the veins, I'm using the same pricking method I used in my leaf bolero video. I'm going over the vein markings on all 4 main pieces with the spiky tracing wheel, on top of my ironing board, but with a few layers of corduroy on top, for extra padding. For the smallest and most tightly curved veins at the ends, I used a T-pin. I'm laying out my pattern pieces on the fabric, holding them down with weights, and brushing chalk dust through the holes. It's harder to make the dust go through in the opposite direction from how the holes were poked, but as long as I can see the line well enough to trace over it with a soft graphite pencil, it works. I eventually realized a big brush would make it go more quickly. I did the same thing on the front and back pieces. No need to mark the midribs though, because there's already a seam there. I need to mark the lines on the lapel facings too. This time I'm tracing over the chalk lines with a light blue fabric pencil. I brushed all the remaining chalk dust off the waistcoat pieces and wiped down my work table with a damp rag. I am going to embroider the front veins, but not on the undersides of the lapels. The stiffness from the embroidery would get in the way of their folding over properly. But I don't want the veins to end there, so I'm painting them on the underside of the lapel. I'm using dark brown fabric ink and a thin, flat paintbrush, stopping a little bit below the fold line. I let those dry and then did the same with the lower edge of the facing, this time using gold ink mixed with a little bit of yellow and a little bit of water. This one wasn't really necessary since the outside is going to be embroidered and the inner part of the facing will never show, but I just wanted the lines to continue to the edge of the piece. As always, I must mention that this is screen printing ink, so it's not meant for painting and it's not the best texture for it, but I'm just trying to use what I already have. I accidentally got a little spot of ink on the fabric, but it mostly came off, and it's on the lining where it won't show. A bit later I remembered that the underlap also needed to be painted, since the waistcoat is meant to be fully buttoned up and it wouldn't make sense to do embroidery there. I once again referenced the pattern to mark the top and bottom of the center front line using pins, lined them up to get the correct overlap, and marked all the edge points on the veins with more pins. Then I painted the unseen portions of the veins, keeping a couple centimeters in from where the edge will be. The back also needed painting. I realized that the center back basting would get in the way, so I replaced it with a running stitch in more of that light brownish cotton thread. I don't really think this was necessary, but for some reason I was worried about the center back seams being lined up symmetrically. I then mixed up a somewhat lighter, more orangey brown ink and painted all the back veins on. Waistcoats are meant to be worn underneath coats, so doing embroidery on the back would be unnecessarily bulky and not a very good use of time. But I still wanted it to look nice and leafy all the way around. This ink needs heat setting, but it has to dry for at least 24 hours first, so I will do that a bit later. And the fronts still need more preparation before they're ready to embroider. I need to do the buttonholes, but first I'll cover the buttons, just to make sure I do the holes the right size. I'm using 1.5cm wooden molds and we'll need 7 of them. I'm tracing my button pattern onto the right side of some scraps of orange silk. I cut them out with about 5mm of seam allowance. This fabric frays pretty badly, so I had to be careful while folding in the edge and stitching around it. I'm using a thin old thread that might be linen, I don't know, but whatever it is, it's very strong. Sorry if you can hear clunking noises, that's icicles falling off the roof. The fabric is quite bulky, so I sprayed it with water to help the gathers smush into place. For more information on covered buttons, see the video I made about them. I also have a video on buttonholes, which is the next thing I've got to do here. I already had the tips marked, and I drew marks further in along the vein lines to get the length of the buttonholes. Because the fabric frays so much, and because none of the holes are lined up with the grain line, I'm doing 2 rounds of backstitching before cutting instead of just 1. After opening them with my buttonhole cutter, I'm doing the whip stitches more closely together than usual. I did the first one with that thin old thread that was already on my needle, but for the rest I went back to the variegated cotton. The next thing I did was finish off the front armholes. I could have done this before starting the buttonholes and it would have been a better order for filming, though it wouldn't have made a difference in the garment itself. I clipped around the seam allowance, keeping a couple millimeters in from the traced line, and pressed it inwards. I've had some people ask me why I clip diagonally, and it's just because it spreads out the clippiness more smoothly. I creased the lining around that folded edge with my thumb so I could clearly see where it is. Then I trimmed it down, clipped it, and folded it under so it was about 1 millimeter in from the edge. Then I could fell it down with small whip stitches. After that, the armhole needed ironing. And since it had now been more than a day since I did the last of the painting, I heat set all the ink too, pressing it on a high setting with a silk organza press cloth. A very worn out press cloth full of holes. Since filming this, I have cut a new one. The pressing around the lapel area made the bulky seam allowances show through the fabric again, but at least the rest of that seam is still nice and smooth. I finished heat setting all the ink on the front and the back. I basted the back lining to the outer fabric. I went around the shoulder, armhole, and side with some old cotton thread, keeping 4 centimeters in from the edge. That'll keep the layers in place while still leaving enough room to get in there and sew the side seams. Making sure to fold back the lapels so the lining would be shifted into place, I laid the pattern pieces back on the fronts and traced the side and shoulder seam lines onto the lining. I did a running stitch right next to that traced line, on the seam allowance side, so it'll be hidden once the back is sewn on. These seam allowances are all going to face towards the back, so it's okay to close the edges up. Getting back to the buttonholes, I want them to blend smoothly into the tips of the veins, and since the buttonholes are much wider than the veins will be, that means doing one side of the buttonholes to match the fabric and the other side to match the veins. This dark brown matches the vein floss pretty well. And I didn't have any cotton pearl to match the fabric, but the last bit of orangey yellow from the brown leaf bolero was close enough. I'm waxing the tip of my thread and burying it in between the layers. Then doing buttonhole stitches along the top edge only. No bar tacks on these because I don't want them to look boxy. I'm just burying the thread after finishing the top row. I did all the orangey gold stitching first, on the top edges of the buttonholes, and then did the lower halves in the dark brown. I think they look pretty good, and the yellowish thread blends in better than I expected. Once again, I have a separate video on hand-sewn buttonholes if you're looking to make more normal ones. And by normal I mean 18th century. Now it was finally time to start embroidering the veins. These are all going to be couched, and I want them to increase in thickness. I'm starting off with a full 6 strands of embroidery floss and taking just 1 stitch on the tip of this vein. I've cut the floss twice as long as the vein needs to be, plus a few extra centimeters, so I can match up the ends and pull them till the middle of the floss piece is at the tip of the vein. To couch it down, I'm using dark brown cotton quilting thread, which I'm waxing and doubling. I hid the tie off underneath where the floss will lay and started couching it down with fairly closely spaced stitches. For the first little bit I was just holding the long floss tails down with my hand, but then I started pinning them in place, which made it easier. I did this first vein without adding any extra to it, but I got it at least a little bit tapered by making the couching stitches narrower at the beginning and wider near the end. Once I finished the couching, I threaded each end of the floss back onto a large needle and ran it under the fabric and back out again. I sewed through it a few more times with the couching thread before bringing that thread to the back and tying it off. Doing that little bit of running stitch with the floss was not necessary, but this was the first vein and I was still figuring things out. For the next vein, I measured out another piece of floss, twice the length plus a few extra centimeters, and started it off in the same way as the previous one. After I'd couched more than half of it on, I cut a new piece of floss to add. This one I split in half, so as to have a gradual increase instead of doubling the size of the vein. I took one big stitch under the silk, right on the pencil line, and matched up the ends to center it just like before. Then I could smooth out all 4 thread tails, pin them down, and continue couching. Near the end I ran out of couching thread and tied it off on the lining side. Then I started a new thread on the surface of the silk, right underneath the ends of the floss. This time I tried finishing off the floss ends by bringing them directly to the back, finishing the couching, and splitting the ends of the floss so I could tie each one in a knot on its own. For the next one I started off splitting my floss in half and staggering the ends a bit, but I don't think this helped any. Embroidery floss is pretty squishy, so you can vary the width just by making the couching stitches wider or narrower. Next I added a couple lengths of floss to the top end of the non-painted section of that midrib, and distributed some floss around to several more veins. I did some more veins, and now I'm adding extra bits of floss to the later sections before starting the couching. All of these have a few centimeters of extra at the ends, so the veins have little ponytails hanging down the inside of the midrib. Around this time I realized it would be a good idea to do a running stitch along all the pencil lines. That way the lining and outer layers would stay in place, and there would be no danger of all the embroidery making things shift around. Once that was done, I got back to couching. I'm using an old iron as a weight to hold down one end of the waistcoat front. Now my left hand can pull it tightly off the edge of the table, and my right hand can do a lot of stab stitching. For the veins that end in buttonholes, I'm starting my floss at an angle, pushing the needle underneath a few buttonhole stitches, bringing it back up to the surface, and running it back out under those buttonhole stitches again. Unlike the first front, I'm starting off the floss on all the veins of the second front before I start couching. I only had 2 skeins of the very dark brown, and wanted to distribute it evenly around the leaf before switching to another color. The buttonhole veins looked a bit too thin, so I added another split strand of floss to each of them. Since all this floss is doubled, that made each of those veins start off with 3 full pieces of embroidery floss. While I'd started off matching up the floss tails evenly, I was now leaving them at slightly different lengths so that they'd lay more smoothly in the midrib. I split my floss a lot thinner than necessary for these. I ran out of the very dark brown and switched to a slightly less dark brown, which I also only had 2 skeins of. I added extra little bits of this floss into the wider sections of all the veins, smoothing out the floss and curling the ends out of the way as I went. Once all the vein floss was in place, I started couching, pinning the long tails in place along the pencil marks, just like before. Since the wider ends of the veins will need to flow into the midrib, I'm not couching them down all the way to the seam. I'm stopping a few millimeters away from it. Couching the wider parts leaves pretty long stitches on the lining, but I don't think they're in danger of snagging on anything while being worn, so it's okay. Sometimes I accidentally didn't get a stitch pulled all the way through, which is fixable if I catch it in time. And if I don't catch it in time, I can just sew down that little loop to the lining so it doesn't move. While some more of this embroidery footage plays, I would just like to say thank you very much to my Patreon supporters for helping me pay my bills. The lower tier of the Patreon has a monthly update post on the video stuff I'm working on, and very, very rarely I make a behind the scenes video there, but I don't have very many. I think I will do a sketchbook tour video sometime soon. The higher tier has 4 dinosaur comics a month, so it's not a very cohesive Patreon altogether, but that's just the way it worked out. My goodness, I hate doing self-promotion, but I really should try to do it more often. These videos take a lot of time and effort to make, and they usually earn tens of dollars a month, so the Patreon really helps to balance it out and make it possible to spend this much time on them. I do have a part-time alterations job, but that also does not pay well. Also, I should mention that I have a Spoonflower and a Redbubble, though it's been a very long time since I've added any new prints to them. Anyways, once I had finished couching all the veins, it was time to sort out the midrib. I smoothed all those floss ends downwards, and felt for the places where the floss was thinnest. I only had a little bit of my last skein left, and had decided that the reddish-brown floss was too different and wouldn't work, so I had to be careful with my remaining floss. I split it and added tiny little strands into the sparsest areas of the midrib. With a lot of these I could take several small stitches close together and then cut the thread loops in between them. Once the last bit of floss was used up, I drew outlines for the width of the midrib. I smoothed all the floss ends back down and started couching. For the ends of the veins, I'm couching them down separately for a little bit, so I can alternate stitches and make them blend into the midrib more smoothly. These couching stitches are so long and the large mound of floss is so movable that I started using a large pin to guide the threads into place as I tightened them. I really don't know why I kept tying off the threads on the lining when it was so easy to hide them under the floss at this point. When I got near the bottom of this midrib, I strayed too far inwards, so I stopped and pulled out the 2 narrow couching stitches and redid them. Once I was about 1.5 centimeters from the bottom edge, it was time to bury all those floss ends. I put a big needle most of the way through the fabric, put one short bit of floss through the eye, pulled it through, and trimmed the end off. I did this for all the ends that were long enough, and for the few short ones I just trimmed them a bit. The couching stitches are so close together that they keep all those cut floss ends pretty well contained. I made the spacing even closer as I couched down the last little bit on the bottom. Then I finished couching the other midrib in the same way. These very long couching stitches would be okay for a piece of wall art, but they're definitely not sturdy enough for a wearable garment, so I'm tacking them down on the midrib and on some of the wider parts of the veins. The longer the couching thread, the more stitches I did, and I tried to space them pretty evenly. This may not look as nice and round as the original couching stitches, but it's more important that they not turn into a horrible frayed mess. Now it was time to embroider the lapel facings with that metallic gold floss I decided on earlier. I'm couching it down with metallic gold thread, using the same basic method as I did on the brown veins. I'm splitting it and starting off with two very springy and uncooperative strands. I made one stitch in the tip of the vein, anchored my one strand of metallic sewing thread, and began couching, once again keeping the floss pinned in place. When it was time to finish off the thread, I couldn't tie it off on the back since that was the painted underside of the lapel, so I did a few spaced back stitches right along the side of the vein and carefully tied it off and buried the knot under the edge. Though I could have just tied it off under the end of the floss. Again, I don't know why I kept forgetting that. The metallic floss may be annoying to work with, but once it's on there, it's very good at lying in a smooth line. After finishing these veins, I buried the floss ends between the fabric layers, the same way as before, by putting the needle through first and then threading the floss in and pulling it through. Since the floss is so slippery, I wanted to make sure it was sewn in place before I cut the ends off, so I finished my couching just a little ways in from the fold line, before tying off the threads and trimming all the floss ends. I ironed the fronts again, lined up the center front line, and marked the button locations through the holes. I sewed the buttons on with heavy-duty yellow thread, making little wrapped thread shanks as usual. I talk more about sewing on buttons in my covered button video. I pinned the side and shoulder seams, making sure the back lining was out of the way, and basted them with a running stitch. I tried on the waistcoat to make sure it fit, which it mostly did, so I went over those 4 seams again with a back stitch. I pressed all of those seams, clipped the seam allowances, and also trimmed and clipped the back armholes. After creasing and folding those edges in, I folded in the back lining on all remaining edges and basted them down, both so I could try it on again to make extra sure everything was lying smoothly, and so I wouldn't have a ton of pins sticking out as I felled down the lining edges with a small whip stitch. I pulled out the basting, and the construction was all done. But I had started to notice a problem. The front edge was getting a bit fuzzy. Small fibers were pulling out of the seam from just the handling it had gotten during the construction process, which did not bode well for wearability. As mentioned, this silk frays quite easily, and I should not have trimmed the seam allowance down so small. I tried scratching at the edge of the sample, and as I feared, it frayed horribly. But I tried painting some textile medium along the edge, and it was very successful at preventing the fraying. This stuff is meant to mix with paint to make it into washable fabric paint, but it's also used to glue silk fibers together for silk fusion, which is kind of like a papery material made of silk. I figured since it does such a good job of gluing silk fibers together for that, it ought to help here, and it did. So I applied it all along the edge of the waistcoat with a small paintbrush. It did leave an obvious dark line along the edge, but I was already feeling dissatisfied with the way the lapels looked, so I was happy to try some gold ink dry brushing. First on the sample, then on the actual lapels. I used a very dense round brush. Once I'd finished the lapel facing edges, I added some more dry brushing to the main fabric in red and yellow inks. Autumn leaves have so much variation, and this feels much more realistic than plain solid orange. I put painter's tape over the edges of the back piece to keep from getting any ink on there. At this point I tried it on once again, and admitted I had to fix the fit problem that had been bugging me. The front was standing up too straight and stiffly, and was gaping away from my chest. I figured the best way to deal with this was to move the top 3 buttons down. I marked new locations for all 3, cut them off, pulled out all the old bits of thread, and sewed them on slightly lower. For the underlap, I just made a little dart in the edge, so the same amount of fullness would be taken out on that side. On a regular waistcoat it would look terrible to have moved the buttons like this, but on a leaf waistcoat it adds a nice ripple to the edge and makes it even more realistically leafy. I stab stitched the edge of the dart in place, and I was going to sew down the underside too, but it held so well that I didn't need to bother. The lapels still felt incomplete, so I figured some gold beads might be what they needed. I'm back to the variegated cotton thread, even though it doesn't match the gold. concentrated the beads more densely around the edge of the lapel and spread them out farther in, just like the gold ink. I did not put any beads on the part of the right lapel that gets covered up by the overlap. I considered adding a few more beads to the rest of the waistcoat, but decided that a few beads would not be enough and a lot of beads would distract from the embroidery. The original pencil marks from the 3 buttons I moved were bugging me, so I covered them up with a bit more fabric ink. If this were a brown, older leaf, I would be happy to add some fungus spots, but it's meant to be a relatively fresh one. It's difficult to iron things when there's beads and buttons and veins in the way, so after all the ink was sufficiently dried, I gave it a good going over with the garment steamer I got at an estate sale. At school in the textile studio, we had a big tubular steamer thing that we rolled up fabric inside of and used for heat-setting ink and dye paste, so hopefully this is sufficient. After finishing the waistcoat, I made a coordinating leaf kerchief out of leftover lining cotton, but I didn't film any of it because I already have a leaf kerchief video in which I make a very similar one. I did some gold dry brushing on one corner to match the lapels. Before I get to the reveal, I really want to fix the pattern, but I'll try to be quick. I cut my original pattern fronts along the midribs. I cut from the front edge to the midrib in 3 places and overlapped the edges to take it in by about the same amount as the dart and moving the buttons did. I sewed a lined mock-up in really thick polyester, but ended up with almost the same fit problem again, just lower down. I realized that the heat from my iron had shrunk and distorted the crappy polyester, making this mock-up totally useless. So that was a waste of time. I then went back to the pieces of my original mock-up, added an extra layer of polycotton bed sheets to the fronts for more stability, and re-sewed all the seams. I pinched out a dart of extra material in the front and pinned it. I made the bottom of the lapel fold line lower down than on the original waistcoat. I also wanted to make the lapels a bit bigger, so I pinned a scrap on top and scribbled a larger blob on it. I marked the dart size and location and drew it on more visibly with a ruler. I peeled apart the previous alteration and taped it back in the original shape. A nice thing about this wallpaper is it's easy to peel the tape off without damaging it. I drew on the lapel fold line as indicated on the mock-up. In order to cut the lapel facing in one piece, I'll need to make sure any shaping I add to the midrib is below where the facing will end. This time I drew only 2 lines on the front. Doing just one would have been okay, but I was worried about having a sharp angle on the edge of my piece. I didn't really explain it in the voiceover, but for more information on moving dart fullness around, you should go watch a video on dart manipulation. The Closet Historian made one recently, so I will link to that in the description. Now I'm kind of wondering if I should make a version where I've intentionally widened some of these sections so I can get that little leafy ripple along the edge on purpose. If I do that, I'll wait till after I've sewn up another version. Now I've got a pattern that should hopefully fit, but I've also ruined the serrations, and I want to try making them bigger next time anyways. I traced a new copy of both pieces with the lapels still together and redrew the serrated edge. I reduced the number of buttons from 7 to 6, accounting for the lower fold line on the lapel. I cut out this new front without yet cutting through the lapel, traced another copy, and then marked out the new facing. I cut that out, and its accompanying front lining pieces, and cut the last bit of midrib seam in between the lapels on the outer pieces. And I made some new interfacing pieces. This time just for the bottom edge, the buttonhole edge, and the area where the buttons will go. I still have to figure out where exactly on the pattern to put the button interfacing because the shaping makes it more complicated than just lining up the center front lines and marking the overlap. I didn't want to make a whole separate lining and facing pattern for such a tiny difference in the shoulder, so I just put a little note in a couple of places saying to add extra seam allowance. Since I sew it up following the line on the outer fabric, it'll be fine. I'm really looking forward to sewing this up again at some point, but for the moment I'm trying to be restrained so I can get work done on some other stuff. Okay, here's the finished waistcoat on me. Overall, I'm tolerably happy with how this turned out. I have a lot of criticisms, but I think I've covered most of them already in the process of fixing them. Really, the only thing I don't like about the finished waistcoat is the size and placement of the lapels. I wish I'd used a lighter color fabric for the facing. I did consider a straw-colored silk, but for some reason I went with a darker orange instead, even though the underside of a leaf is usually lighter than the top. I put way too much stiffening in the fronts, and while it still has the fit problem without it, that made it a lot worse. Looking at it now, it's a foolish amount of interfacing, but I do know what I was thinking. I had a picture in my head of a double-breasted waistcoat with a much narrower overlap, and with buckram along the front edges where the buttons and holes are, and I just warped it to fit the new shape. But it doesn't need anywhere near that much. It doesn't even have the second row of buttons that a double-breasted waistcoat has. All it really needs is interfacing on the edge with the buttonholes, extra interfacing where the buttons are, and some light interfacing along the bottom edge. Maybe a little bit just under the lapel fold line up to the side of the neck if the fabric is lightweight. And if I make one with a pocket, I'd want to add some reinforcement around the pocket opening. I'm glad I was able to correct the fit so easily in a way that doesn't show on the outside. I don't remember if I'd already been planning to paint it, but the textile medium fix around the edges seems to have worked out great, and it's not noticeable under the ink. It is disappointing that the short seam allowances on the front edge did that, but it would be fine in a less slippery fabric. I never have any problems when I do it with cotton, and I guess next time I do a silk leaf I can just trim it less and do a whole lot of careful clipping and notching. I'm very pleased with how well the veins blend into the buttonholes, and I like the couching. It's a different effect from the whipped chain stitch I did on the brown leaf bolero, but an equally good one for leaf veins I think. And I'm glad I didn't have to buy anything. This was all stash materials. I would have bought floss if I'd really needed more, but the 4 skeins I had turned out to be the perfect amount. Most of my embroidery floss is thrifted, so I have odd amounts of odd colors. I bought this brown cotton thread a couple years ago for that leaf bolero, and I have used it for so many things already. I got a couple more colors of the same thread recently and was shocked at how much of the brown is used up. I haven't worn the waistcoat much yet because I felt like I shouldn't before the video was finished, but I'm sure I'll wear it this autumn. I think that's everything for now. Thank you for watching, and thank you again to my patrons for helping me eat food and live indoors. Sorry this video took so long to finish. I got sidetracked by the year in review video, and then I started filming 2 other videos. And I don't know which one I'll finish next because I'm going to get my patrons to vote on it. Go clean the lint out of your sewing machine. Bye.